to the center today. We have a very interesting panel, very interesting program before us on the history of the gas centrifuge and its role in nuclear proliferation. Phenomenal panel of experts that I'll introduce in just a moment. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the center is, of course, the nation's memorial to President Woodrow Wilson and an institute of advanced study in the humanities and social sciences. Really what we try to do is to provide a dialogue, forum for dialogue between the policy community here in Washington and the scholarly community, as well as other constituencies here in the United States and globally. We, through the History and Public Policy program, try to provide serious, sober historical context to pressing public policy issues, and I couldn't think of a more appropriate and fitting program than this afternoon's panel on the gas centrifuge and its role in nuclear proliferation. Let me, since we have a short 90 minutes, skip over a whole lot of introduction on my part, just briefly introduce the speakers. We'll go first with Professor Houston Wood. He is Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of Virginia. His area of expertise includes centrifugation, nuclear non-proliferation, and heart pumps. He has published more than 100 articles in books, journals, conference proceedings, and reports. Before joining the University of Virginia, he worked as a development engineer at the Oak Ridge gaseous diffusion plant in the area of uranium enrichment, then as the manager of the centrifuge physics department, that is in the late 70s. He earned his BA and his MS degrees in mathematics from Mississippi State University and his PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Virginia. It's a great pleasure to welcome you and to turn the floor over to you for your presentation. Please.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's very difficult as a professor to give a talk sitting down, but it looks like I'm going to have to figure out how to do this, so I can't wander around too much. It's an honor to be invited to be here, and I am honored that my colleagues Jeffrey and David have agreed to join in this session. A lot of familiar faces in the audience here also, and good to see and reconnect with a lot of people and work in this field. I have a different perspective than others, I think, on the history of the gas centrifuge. I have some points that I like to bring up, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the early history. I'm not going to explain to you how to build a gas centrifuge. If you were here to learn that, you came to the wrong meeting, but I'm going to focus on the history. In the early days, let's see if this is going to work. I have to press harder. Isotopes were discovered in the early 1900s. And so shortly after that, people began thinking about how might we separate one isotope from another isotope. And isotopes are elements that are chemically the same, but they have different molecular weights. And so there are numerous isotopes that have numerous elements that have isotopes, but the one that people are interested in, at that time, people were just interested in any isotope. And the idea of using a centrifuge was first suggested by Lindemann and Aston in 1919. Then other people tried some unsuccessful experiments, but the first successful experiment was done at the University of Virginia by Professor Jesse Beams in the physics department there. And I guess since I've been at Virginia for a long time, my connection with Beams and his what he did, I always like to point that out. It's always interesting to me. Many people who know something about the history still don't know that he was involved in that. But during the Manhattan Project, there were attempts to make enriched uranium using gas centrifuges, but they were unsuccessful. And Professor Beams, picture of him shown here, from 1898 to 1977. I had the pleasure of knowing him and working with him. He was a delightful and brilliant gentleman. But start the history at the early days at the University of Virginia, we had work was on centrifuges started during the Manhattan Project. There were a number of failures. Building gas centrifuges was very hard. Getting these things to spin at very high speeds of rotation was very challenging. There were new things. And so eventually the project was terminated. And then, so that was shortly after the Manhattan Project. It was terminated, and there was a period that was roughly 1944, 45. And so nothing was done in the United States for a period of time. But then there was some concern over the potential competition from German centrifuges, and that led the AEC to restart the work at Virginia. They were concerned that, at first I think that the U.S. thought that anything that Germany did we would have access to, but then they became concerned that they wouldn't have that access. And so they started a program under one of Jesse Beam's graduate students, PhD student, Bob Coulthall. And this project started up, and while that was happening in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, other things were going on around the world. In Europe, the German research was being led by Konrad Bayerle in Göttingen and Wilhelm Groth in University of Bonn. And also there was research in the Netherlands by Jacob Kistemacher. So all these people were making progress in gas centrifuges. And everyone was working fairly independently. And then in the USSR, at the end of World War II, the Soviets took a lot of POWs from Germany. They started an effort to develop nuclear weapons. They saw what the United States had done, and they felt like they wanted to pursue that. They had an organization at SINOP. They had their uranium enrichment activities were taking place, and there were 3 different groups that were put together. One was by von Arding, electromagnetic separation of isotopes. A person by the name of Thiessen was pursuing gaseous diffusion. And Max Steenbeck had a group. Max Steenbeck was a physicist, and his group was looking at several different methods, but the gas centrifuge was one of the methods that his group was looking at. There began to be competition between gaseous diffusion and the gas centrifuge. There were reported problems with the gaseous diffusion not being able to enrich the uranium U-235 to a high enough concentration to make a weapon. And there was discussion of using a centrifuge for topping this off. In other words, the gaseous diffusion plant could make it to some amount, and then the gas centrifuge could take it from there up to the necessary enrichment for a nuclear weapon. And there was also competition in Russia, in the Russian area there, in their development, between long rotors and short rotors. A short rotor spins at a frequency that can be the same height, but when you have a long rotor, then the rotor goes through flexural modes, shapes, and you have critical speeds that you have to negotiate. That is, it will have vibration speeds that could cause it to fail. And anyway, the long rotor was debated, and there were 2 different groups. Steenbeck had a theory. Max Steenbeck was this theoretical physicist, and he had developed a theory that would predict the isotope separation performance of a very long centrifuge. So he had assumed basically an infinitely long centrifuge, and with that assumption, his theory would work. And so he was pushing the long rotor, and others were pushing the short rotor, which was mechanically simpler to build. And then the Steenbeck group got transferred to the Kiev plant in Leningrad around 1951. The Steenbeck had managed to get concessions from the Soviets. First of all, these were prisoners of war, and the prisoners of war had entered into an agreement with their captors that they would try to develop a gas centrifuge. And Steenbeck managed to get concessions from the Soviets that the Germans would be released when they were successful. And Steenbeck's group won the competition, the centrifuge competition, over the gas centrifuge. and other competing groups in the Russian research and development going on there. And they were transferred to Leningrad around September 1953. They were going to have a quarantine period. So the Russians, the Soviets at that time, did not want to release them immediately. They wanted there to be a cooling off period so that the Soviets could make progress over the next few years, and that these German scientists who had been working with them would forget everything that they had done. That was sort of the plan for the cooling off period. Well, one of the people that was in this effort was Dr. Gurneau Zippo. Zippo was a flight instructor for Germany during World War II. And I had the pleasure of knowing Zippo for many years. And he told the story was that he was too good a pilot for the Germans to risk being shot down. So they had him become an instructor. So that's the way he spent the war. And then he became a POW in Russia after the war. Just before the war started, he had earned his doctorate in engineering. And so here he was in Russia, and he was taken in as a member of the Steenbeck group to work on gas centrifuges. And he was a strong proponent of having the short centrifuge rotors. Short meaning less than a meter, just for purposes of thinking about that. So, and long rotors would be several meters long. And he refused to work on the long rotors, which ultimately in the Russian program at that time failed. So they were not able to make the long rotors work. But Zippo worked on the short rotors. Sorry, I forgot to update all that stuff. Yeah. And he didn't go back to Russia. He left there roughly in 1945, 1955, after the cooling off period. And he didn't return to Russia until the year 2000. And in 2000, there was a meeting held in Moscow, meeting of the Workshop on Separation Phenomena in Liquids and Gases, which is a group that meets every couple of years to discuss uranium enrichment and other areas in the technology area. And so Zippo came back to Russia, and he was treated very royally. They treated him very nicely. The Russians at that time, this is post the Cold War. And here's a picture when we were at the meeting. There was a dinner cruise on the river that night, and so everyone is walking down from the meeting to get on the boat to go on a cruise. And there was a custom that maybe many cultures have this custom, but I was introduced to it there, to offer someone who has been away from many years, when they return, you offer them salt and bread. And so as you boarding this boat, there was a big loaf of bread and a big vat of salt. And so Zippo was given the bread first, and he dipped it in there. And there were about 100 of us getting on the ship. And then everyone followed suit. And it was almost like a religious experience. But it was fascinating. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself here, and that's a picture of Zippo in 2000. And he passed away in May of 2008. But when he came to the United States, so he had been working in the Soviet Union. Post-war, he came back to Europe after the cooling off period in Russia, and he was met in Germany. He was met by Dr. Oswald Mike Schutte, who ended up being a professor. He was in naval intelligence at that time. Mike ended up being professor of physics at the University of South Carolina. But he interviewed Russian POWs, including Zippo. So when all the Russian POWs were leaving the Soviet Union, I should say, the Soviet Union POWs, when they were leaving there and coming back to their home, they were being interviewed. And the AEC at that time was interested in Zippo. So they saw he had been working, his exit interview showed that he had been working on gas centrifuges and uranium enrichment, so our government was interested in him. So under a fake passport, Zippo was brought to Washington and interviewed by Bob Coulthall and some intelligence officers in Washington. The interview went well, and so it was decided to bring Zippo to Charlottesville, to the University of Virginia, to meet with Professor Beams. And so Schutte escorted him to Charlottesville, along with Coulthard and some others. So then Zippo then returned after this interview. Zippo returned to UVA in 1958 under contract to the Atomic Energy Commission to reproduce the work he had done in Russia. A little side story in the middle of that, between Zippo's first visit to Washington and before he came to Charlottesville, there was a meeting that Kistemaker had organized in the Netherlands. And so all the people working on centrifuges around the world were coming to this meeting. And so Zippo was going and Coulthard was going. And so the U.S. intelligence agents told them not to let people know that they knew each other. They didn't want them to know that they had already met. And so Coulthard said he was in the lobby of the hotel where the meeting was being held, and Coulthard started to go into a telephone booth. Some of you here remember telephone booths. I think we should reinvent them, actually. But anyway, so he said he was going into a telephone booth to make a phone call, and as he's ready to go in, out comes Zippo. And so they have to act like they don't know each other. So Coulthard is still around in Charlottesville, and he still can bring up some of these memories. So anyway, Zippo got a contract with AEC to come to University of Virginia and reproduce the work that he had done in the Soviet Union. And Coulthard turned out to be the project manager for this effort. And Zippo was in a separate building from the classified gas centrifuge work was going on there. Well, sorry. Yes, there was some classified work at that time. It was separate from the work that Zippo was doing, because Zippo was not a U.S. citizen. And so the Ordnance Research Lab was where the classified work was underway. And they did separation tests to demonstrate that the gas centrifuge that Zippo had built when he came to University of Virginia would work. So they had to measure the assays and so forth. Zippo was given a very good technician, a very good mechanic who could help build things, and they made very rapid progress, and he seemed to be able to go by memory very quickly from the things that he was supposed to have forgotten during a cooling off period. But he did, from 1959 until 1960, he did this work in Virginia, and when the separation tests showed that the gas centrifuge was a viable means for separating uranium isotopes, then the AEC immediately classified the project, said, by the Atomic Energy Act, it had to be classified. And so they gave Zippo a choice either to go to become a U.S. citizen and stay in the United States and work, or to return to, or he'd have to leave the country and not work on the project. And so he chose to go back to Germany. And he went to Germany and worked for a company called Degoosa. It was a predecessor company of what eventually became Urenco, a consortium of Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands. So that's what gets us up to 1960. And in 1960, when Zippo was asked to leave, he wrote a report. This report, it's called ORO 615. ORO stood for Oak Ridge Operations Office, and this report was written, and everything sort of before that report was considered unclassified, and everything after that report in the United States was considered classified. And that hasn't changed. And then another player in this field is Dr. A.Q. Khan. He was a native of Pakistan, and he worked for Urenco in the Netherlands. And when the Indians set off their peaceful nuclear device in 1973, I think it was, then Bhutto called for expatriates to come back to Pakistan and help out. And so Khan took drawings from Urenco circa 1974. He carried them back to Pakistan, and then he helped develop gas centrifuge program in Pakistan and headed the A.Q. Khan Research Institute. So, picture of A.Q. Khan. So there have been, up to now, 3 major players in this game, Beams, Zippo, and Con. So after the first Gulf War in 1991, IAEA inspectors discovered centrifuges in Iraq. In 2002, there were aluminum tubes headed for Iraq were alleged to be for centrifuges. It was proven to be false, but the long secret subject of gas centrifuges was now being discussed in the media. When I first went to work in Oak Ridge, Tennessee on gas centrifuges, you didn't tell anyone that you worked on gas centrifuges. It was an incredibly dark subject. And no one ever used those words in the media. But in October 2002, the DPRK stated they were building a centrifuge plant. It was known that Con had been there. And by January of 2003, North Korea denied this. Since then, they've said they have centrifuges. So the story is developing. I'm just talking about the history, so I can't talk about anything that's happening this year. That's not history, or last year even. But in February 2003, the Albright visited the enrichment plant in Natanz. And during the Second Gulf War in 2003, Obeidi turned over centrifuge parts that had been buried in his backyard. In 2004, Libya gave up their centrifuges. And the Con network was involved in all of this all these various countries had gotten involved. And so here's a picture that I attribute to Alex Glazer at Princeton. He put this together, so I'm borrowing his slide. So you can see sort of the first steps of where the gas centrifuge went. And then we got Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Libya, North Korea. And then we've got Brazil, Australia. And that's just how it's spread. I thought I would take just a brief minute just to show sort of what a gas centrifuge is without getting too technical. So a gas centrifuge is a hollow cylinder that rotates at very high speeds. So it's made of a material that allows it high-speed rotation. A gas is introduced into this rotating cylinder. The rotating cylinder is contained in an outer cylinder to protect it in case it fails, so that if it crashes, you have a lot of energy in this high-speed rotating parts. And if it crashes, you can cause a big mess. And so you keep it in a cylinder, a casing to protect it. And also you maintain a vacuum so that the cylinder is rotating in a vacuum so you don't add aerodynamic heating. So the gas then circulates in a counterclockwise way, and the gas is separated radially because it's in a centrifugal field, and the heavy isotope is pushed to the outer wall and the light isotope pushed to the inner wall. And then the circulation that's shown in the picture there allows the heavier isotope to move to the bottom and the lighter isotope to move to the top. And a single centrifuge is not enough to do the job that you want to do, so you hook a lot of centrifuges up together. You hook them up in series because each centrifuge will enrich the isotope a certain amount. So you hook them up in series to get more separation. You hook them up in parallel to produce more material. And that's called a cascade. So separative work is how you define, is the figure of merit for looking at a gas centrifuge. And enrichment of uranium is measured in kilograms. Separative work units are kilograms of uranium. Separative capacity is the separative work per unit time. To fuel a typical power reactor requires about 125,000 separative work units per year. And if a single centrifuge has a separative capacity of 10, or a separative capacity of 10, then that centrifuge, the cascade would require 12,500 centrifuges. And a separative work example, you can calculate, here's natural uranium being fed with a product of 1 kilogram. It's been enriched from natural uranium to 3%, and the separative work required is slightly over 4 separative work units. But centrifuges can take many different sizes and shapes, and the Russian centrifuges that Zippo worked on, here's a picture of one of the Russian plants, and the centrifuges that Zippo had are short centrifuges, and they're stacked on top of one another. and it's just a big plumbing thing. You've got pipes running everywhere, a chemical engineer's dream. And so centrifuges can be short. Here's Centrifuge Hall in Almelo in the Netherlands, one of the Urenco plants. And you can see these are longer. I think it's pretty obvious these are longer than the ones in Russia. And here are American centrifuges, which are even longer than the Russian centrifuges. So centrifuges don't all look alike. They don't all come in any single flavor. And one thing you need to keep in mind about uranium enrichment is any uranium enrichment process can be used to make material for fuel in either a nuclear power reactor or for a bomb. For a nuclear power reactor, you want to make it enrich the uranium-235 to somewhere between 3 and 5%. To make a nuclear weapon, you want to enrich it to something more than 90%. So any technique that'll do one thing will do the other. And so the line between a civilian and military use is very thin. And a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to figure out are the ways to thicken this line so that you can have a clear delineation of whether it's a military or civil application. How can you thicken the line? Lots of ideas are looked at, but transparency and inspections are certainly a part of that. Safeguards measures, materials accountability and control. I think another thing that hasn't been done is really defining a trigger event. If a state were to have some event that would define a trigger, and then clearly stating what would be the response to that trigger event. Now, all that for transparency and inspections and safeguards all means that you have a centrifuge plant or a uranium enrichment plant that is has been declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency and is being inspected. Clandestine facilities are a totally different issue, because if you don't know they're there, you certainly can't safeguard them or protect them. So I will stop at this point, and I don't know if you want questions now or after the other speakers.
I think we'll wait until we've had the comments. Thank you very much, Professor Wood. We'll continue now once we get the laptop hooked up with David. David Albright, of course, is the president of the Institute for Science and International Security here in Washington, D.C. Prior to founding ISIS, he worked as a senior staff scientist at the Federation of American Scientists and as a member of the research staff at Princeton University's Center for Energy and Environmental Studies. He has a number of publications to his credit and received a 1992 Olive Branch Award for a series of articles he wrote, along with Mark Hibbs, on the Iraqi nuclear weapons program for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He cooperated actively with the IAEA Action Team from 1992 to 1997, focusing on analyses of Iraqi documents and past procurement activities, and he was, I believe, the first non-governmental inspector of the Iraqi nuclear program in 1996. He holds a Master's of Science degree in physics from IU, from Indiana University, and a Master's of Science in Mathematics from Wright State University. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this panel today, and I hope we can get the laptop
This isn't my talk. I'm looking at my talk on the screen, but somehow there's a communication mismatch. So hopefully someone will come in quickly and straighten this out. Well, so for me, it's always a pleasure to be at a session on that's historical. I mean, at ISIS, we collect information. I've been collecting it for, at least for myself, for well over 2 decades. And we rarely ever get to talk about it or use it, unless it's sort of in the issue of the day. So I enjoy this greatly. I saw my role today as to kind of fill in some of the things Houston didn't cover, kind of the how does some of this happen. What did Zippo do? How did Iraq get gas centrifuges? And I'm going to try to do it relatively quickly. And actually, is there a technical person in the room yet?
I think we're getting we're
I mean, Houston.
If this doesn't work,
If only Iran's gas centrifuges worked like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I do. Is it going to go?
I don't know. These are the things that
I always forget. Oh, someone always does it for me, but I thought this. But that technical guy's not around.
this is what he told me to do.
What did
But-
he say?
Function F7 or function F8.
There you go.
Almost go?
It's threatening to work.
Keyboard's enough.
Yeah. One turns it off, so let's see. We'll try it one more time. Okay, I may be able to use handouts. I mean,
If you want to give me a photocopy, I can do that.
yeah, well, I can't do that, but I'll show it. I'll try to show it in some way.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, my flash drive got corrupted, and first thing it did is it turned off my virus protection and fritzed out my computer. So this is partly the result. I don't know if I've been attacked by a Chinese cyber attack or not. This one hasn't been in China, so. But let me go back to talking about Zippo. I mean, Houston talked about how he personally brought back knowledge of a very innovative centrifuge from Russia. The Western ones hadn't been working very well. He brought back innovations that he and the other Germans and the Russians had developed and was able to establish very quickly that this was a remarkable machine. And normally when we talk about centrifuge programs, we talk about Khan, Iran, Iraq, kind of sad stories. I would argue that the Zippo story is actually a good one, and that he, after leaving Charlottesville, in fact, even before, he decided that he didn't want to work in a nuclear weapons program ever again. And that's why he wouldn't take the security clearance. And the United States was, as Houston mentioned, was pretty tough. He had 2 weeks left in his visa, and he was told, you have to leave. And in fact, if you look at one of his reports, and I've seen it at his house, it's actually marked up that he had to leave so quickly that he couldn't finalize one of his very famous reports, and that he has a marked up version, or had it, or still has, it's someplace, where he finished the report that he was contracted to do, at least one of them, the last one. But so he left that quickly. He also wanted to make sure, and again, this is 1960. This is long before the NPT. He wanted to make sure that Germany wouldn't build the bomb. And so one of my slides was, it's a letter that he got from Degoosa that basically...
actually, you please speak in the microphone because this is webcast and people won't hear you.
Can't see it. All right. Okay. Sorry. But he got a letter from Degoosa that basically said, you commit to do everything you can so that this technology that I'm developing cannot either be used directly or indirectly for atomic bombs. And he also refused to allow a system of classification to develop that would be a military in nature. He was so suspicious and so fed up after his experience in Russia and in the United States that he wanted to work in a civilian program that was away from military classification and up front was committed to peaceful uses only. And so in that sense, when he decided to spread the technology into Europe, particularly into Germany, his view was that there should be all kinds of guards, that it could not be for military uses. One of the ironies is that Urenco probably has leaked more than any other company nuclear weapons usable information. And so it was a great, it troubled Zippo tremendously that had happened. And in fact, part of the way I got to know him in the early 90s was that when I was investigating the procurement by Iraqis of gas centrifuge technology, and I was looking and interviewing Germans who'd worked in the centrifuge business and were working with had been working with the Iraqis, he knew all these people, and he knew, and obviously knew a tremendous amount about these early generation centrifuges that are typically the target of countries like Iraq, Pakistan. They don't want the most sophisticated stuff because they have no hope of building it. They want the simpler stuff. And Zippo in a sense, was there at the birth in Germany of all these technologies, hired many of the people, and certainly saw what they did, both in Urenco and then outside. So he was an extremely valuable resource, and was very committed to try to stop proliferation. Unfortunately, most of the cases that I've looked at, the people aren't so noble. And Houston mentioned Khan, and it was, in a sense, an espionage operation by Pakistan to get at the technology, because they, at the time, the early 70s, were desperate to build nuclear weapons. In the case of Iraq, they were also under tremendous pressure to build nuclear weapons by the mid-'80s. And they had created a centrifuge program, and they understood, even though they were quite capable, that they just couldn't do much without better access to sensitive information. And they, like the Pakistanis, realized that you don't need to develop this stuff. You certainly don't need to research it. You just have to find somebody who will essentially sell it to you or leak it. And the Iraqis found a German firm that was working in Iraq already on ballistic missiles, rockets, conventional weaponry, called H&H Metal Form. And they turned out to be the funnel for Iraq to get all kinds of classified centrifuge information out of Germany. And one of the things that I guess, well, I'll try to maybe show it. It may be too complicated. They, in the end, got the help of we believe, four centrifuge experts, one of which has still not been identified to this day. Three are well-known, Walter Busa, Bruno Stemmler, and Karl-Heinz Schopp. And they provided a regular kind of stream of classified documents, valuable assistance, helped the Iraqis gain a lot of experience. And the last one was still located in the kind of the mothership, what was called MAN New Technology in Munich, Germany, and that he was feeding stuff out into the hands principally of Karl-Heinz Schopp until the very end. And what partly this was discovered, and this was one of the things I wanted to show, but I'll just hold it up, was in the sort of the revelations in 1995 by the Iraqis, they revealed a lot, or turned over a lot of documents at what's called the Hyder Farm. And one of the documents was a list of basically titles of English language, or in English, of Urenco documents. They originally had been in German. There were about 164 of them that provided a tremendous amount of knowledge about building and operating these early generation gas centrifuges, and one mid-'80s centrifuge. And so you had this tremendous leakage out of Urenco that was engineered by these four people. And it was critical for the Iraqi centrifuge program. Earlier, these same people had given them designs of several centrifuges, and so with the designs, this backup documentation, and help on materials, they were moving very rapidly to put together a pretty sophisticated gas centrifuge program using these first-generation Urenco centrifuges. And it was only the war in '91 that really disrupted that program. On the other hand, or on the other side, is the Iraqis realized, like Pakistan and others have done, is that now you have the know-how, you now have to get the capability to build the centrifuges and operate them. And so they mounted a pretty aggressive procurement effort with the help of companies like H&H, and then at least three of the gas centrifuge people to go around and buy all the equipment. And one thing I wanted to show was just kind of a laundry list of the companies. Maybe I can just pass this around. I mean, this is just, again, I'm just bringing things that I used to get or got when I was involved in the inspection effort. I'd like it back. But it's just an Iraqi list of the companies where they went and got equipment for a centrifuge. And again, some of you will know what it means. But the point is that they organized a pretty elaborate smuggling network and were quite successful to get the wherewithal to build centrifuges, and found many companies around the world to help them accomplish that. And that was part of their, in a sense, their cleverness was to realize that don't waste your time trying to do this by yourself. Really draw on outsiders. And people like Karl-Heinz Schaap were working with him after the embargo was imposed in 1990. He was organizing the, actually what are called carbon fiber rotors. And he was first making them, a small number, and then organizing to get the equipment so the Iraqis could make it. And he was fully prepared after the embargo to go to Iraq, get the machine operating, program the machine, it's a computer numerically controlled machine, and then start making centrifuges and train the Iraqis on how to do that. So they could have, with him being there, produced hundreds of rotors for gas centrifuges. But in that, the war stopped that effort.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
I think I've got the desktop turned off, but I don't know what keystroke you use to bring this up as for a CTR. It says F8.
Does it work?
It doesn't seem to work. I tried that.
I don't know. Maybe we'll...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for trying. So, okay. How am I doing for time?
What, quarter till?
So I'll wrap it up. All right. Houston had a nice diagram showing how the centrifuges have spread. I mean, kind of to set up Jeffrey, I mean, there have been some major successes, and there's been several failures of efforts to stop gas centrifuge programs in regions of tension. Clearly, Iraq was a success, and so was Libya. Unfortunately, the failures, from my point of view so far, have included Pakistan, Iran, India, North Korea, and we don't know about some other countries that may have desires to get centrifuges. And also, the successes have not been because of export controls, the non-proliferation treaty, the other non-proliferation remedies. The case of Libya was a very successful CIA MI6 operation to disrupt the Khan network, to penetrate it and disrupt it. Case of Iraq, as I mentioned, it was the war in 1991. Most of what Iraq was accomplishing on centrifuge was not known to any intelligence agencies. I mean, obviously parts of it were known. Particularly, they got sloppy on some of their procurement activities, and there were discoveries. But no one knew about Karl-Heinz Schaap, for example, and what he was planning to do until a couple years after the war ended. And no one understood fully what he was prepared to do until he confessed, along with the Iraqis after 1995. And so let me just end that, we can't always depend on intelligence successes or military strikes or interdiction of cargo. And so what are we going to do? That the traditional non-proliferation methods really need some significant repair and bolstering in order to try to find ways to stop the spread of gas centrifuges. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and my apologies too for the technology not working the way it should. I think
I did it. I think
made it more difficult for your presentation. But we're now very pleased to have as our final speaker here today Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, who is the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation, as well as a research scholar at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. He's the author of Minimum Means of Reprisal, China's Search for Security in the Nuclear Age, and founded and maintains the blog armscontrolwonk.com. Before joining the New America Foundation, he was executive director of the Managing the Atom Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He earned his PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland and his BA in philosophy and political science from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this panel, and my hope is we can catch up a little bit on the time to leave as much time as possible for questions and comments by the audience.
Okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to make a highly conceptual point about what the history we've just heard means, and it draws on an article that I published 2 years ago in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which I have here if anyone is interested. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. Normally when I make a conceptual argument about gas centrifuges, I have to explain how they work and how they spread around the world. And so to have two people who are far more eloquent and knowledgeable about the issue go first is incredibly liberating in this regard. As David suggested, the spread of gas centrifuges and gas centrifuge technology means that in some way we're in big trouble. But the interesting question is, what exact kind of trouble are we in? And I started my article in the Bulletin by pointing to a State Department fact sheet that was released before the 2005 NPT Review Conference. And that fact sheet made a specific argument about the kind of trouble we're in. And it said that we faced a crisis of compliance. And the idea was that there were countries all over the world who in very large numbers were cheating on the non-proliferation regime. And it cited Libya, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. I want to suggest that the problem is actually a crisis of confidence. And I think that becomes clear if we look at these four cases. And let's hold aside the very difficult case of the most recent events with Iraq and focus on Libya, Iran, and North Korea. In each of these cases, what really precipitated the current round of hand-wringing was that they were clients of the Con network. Libya had a full program that they were buying from the Con network. Yes, Libya had a full program they were buying from the Con network. Iran has a program that is largely about centrifuges, though not exclusively, and those were supplied in part by the Con network. And North Korea, which had a long-running dispute with the United States over its nuclear weapons program, that problem blew up again in 2002 when it became clear that they were a client of the Con network. And it's sort of interesting that it's basically one non-proliferation failure, the existence of this network trafficking in this relatively novel technology, that triggers this kind of dramatic sense of crisis in the non-proliferation regime. And what I want to suggest is that that is to some extent an overreaction. And it's an overreaction in part because as a community, those of us interested in arms control and non-proliferation, and I count myself fully among them, blew it on this issue. We didn't anticipate the dramatic technological change represented by gas centrifuges. And so I have a sort of favorite example of this. In the 1970s, there was this belief that if a state was going to build a bomb, it was going to do it by the plutonium route. They were going to build a reactor, and they were going to build a reprocessing facility, and they were going to separate plutonium from the spent fuel. Exactly what the North Koreans did, and exactly what it seems Syria was going to do. In a weird way, this was a comforting situation because plutonium facilities are easy to detect. They're large, and they give off a lot of signatures. And there's a wonderful National Academy study a few years ago that made the observation that no facility to make nuclear explosive material has ever been constructed that became operational before we figured out about it. Now, we didn't always have the will to do something about it, but they were always relatively easy to spot. And so I think that led to a certain degree of false confidence on our part. And as for other things like, say, centrifuges, there was the sense that countries like Pakistan couldn't do that. In 1977, the Office of Technology Assessment concluded, and this is a quote, "It is improbable that centrifuge enrichment would be the route taken by a country with a limited industrial and scientific base." Well, boy, were they wrong. I mean, as they were writing this, A.Q. Khan was setting up shop. And so, for some reason, there was this belief that these technologies were exotic and were not available. And I don't understand, but even after Pakistan went this route, even after South Africa went a route that wasn't centrifuges but was based on similar technologies and similar approaches, and even after the war and the disclosure of the Iraqi program in 1991, there was in still some way this slowness to recognize the magnitude of the technological change facing us. Even in 1994, OTA sort of tentatively admits that, and again, it's a quote, gas centrifuge technology may become increasingly attractive to potential proliferants. Well, geez, guys, how many do you need, right, before you decide that this is a real problem? It isn't really until 2002 that this comfortable consensus completely collapses. And Houston and David mentioned, the cases. In August, it's revealed that the Iranians have a centrifuge program because they're digging 2 giant holes in the ground. In October, the United States confronts the North Korean about the possibility that they have a centrifuge enrichment program. And then a year later, the BBC China, which is this AQ Khan chartered ship, is intercepted supplying the Libya program. And sort of from this, the full extent of the Khan network kind of, tumbles out. And, this is, I think, a very frightening realization for analysts. I mean, part of it is the embarrassment that we all missed it, but part of it also is the degree to which what we really missed was not the technology itself, but the degree to which the exotic had become mundane, and the degree to which there were vast suppliers for many of the components, and the degree to which the tools and the materials were now much easier to obtain. My favorite example of this, and I admit it's cherry picking, but it's very funny, is one of the machine tools that was picked up in South Africa that helped unravel the Khan network is made by a firm in Spain. And if you go to their website and look at the advertisement for the type of machines they make, they have a long list. It's in Spanish. My Spanish is terrible, but even I could pick this out. It's a long list of things you can use their machines for. And it ends with kitchenware and armaments. When Williams-Sonoma is the same client as, Libya's nuclear weapons program, things have changed. The second problem is these facilities are very hard to detect. They don't use a lot of electricity. They don't give off particular signatures. A lot of people have tried to do some very innovative work about the kinds of signatures that you might use to try to detect a clandestine centrifuge facility. And without boring you with the details, by and large, it's not very promising. And so I think the result of this is a sense of panic. And panic has a price. And I think that brings us to this fourth case of Iraq prior to the most recent Gulf War, which is, and David has done better work than anyone on this, we have this situation where aluminum tubes have become almost a perfect metaphor for intelligence failure in our lexicon. And if you think about it, a gas centrifuge program is the perfect fear that ties together scanty evidence, right? There is no evidence of a gas centrifuge program. You can't find the facility. You don't know where it's going to be. So, you pick up a shipment of aluminum tubes and you panic because that's the only evidence you're going to get. And so I think, on the one hand, it's understandable that we panicked, but we also have to understand that if we panic, we can rush into action precipitously. And I happen to be of the opinion that we did a very similar thing in North Korea and let an imperfect but still very functionable agreed framework collapse again over a mythical or very small, I should say very small, enrichment program. So what do we do about this in my last couple of minutes? Well, the first thing is don't panic. That's easier to say than it is to do, I'm sure, but it is worth noting that, right, the U.S. intelligence community did penetrate the Khan network. And the U.S. intelligence community did catch the Iranians twice. So it isn't as though this is a completely unsolvable problem. It's just the playing field is tilted a little bit against us. And I think that the U.S. intelligence community is probably going to do a much better job going forward in the sense that there's now a much greater understanding of the degree to which networks are important and this sort of need to focus on procurement strategies rather than simply trying to spot the giant reactor, somewhere in the desert. The second thing is I think we have to spend a lot more time worrying about undeclared facilities. In the past, because facilities were relatively easy to spot, the challenge was basically safeguarding them so that they were not diverted. Today, that's probably not true. It's probably a lot easier to build a clandestine facility, and I would submit that that's what we have now seen the Iranians try to do twice. So as we focus on building new tools to deal with non-proliferation, I think our focus has to be much less on tightening safeguards at facilities that we know about and much more about getting the kind of access that would reveal facilities we don't. And in some sense, we do have some of those tools available. After the first Gulf War, the IAEA created the Additional Protocol, which is a substantial elaboration on safeguards that was designed in part to help identify clandestine facilities. It has some additional access procedures in it. It should certainly be a high priority in U.S. policy to make sure that that is universally adhered to. And to a second order, we should focus on ways that we can strengthen it. Now, I will submit to you, doing more on the intelligence side and slightly more access in the safeguards universe is not a perfect solution. There are always going to be cheaters, and there are always going to be hard cases. But I would submit that there is a real value to limiting the number of proliferation cases to a few hard cases that we can focus on, rather than just simply throwing up our hands in despair, which I would submit is what the 2005 State Department fact sheet did. But there is a broader question, and I will close with this thought, about whether over the long run, as we see these manufacturing technologies spread and become incredibly mundane, what that means about the rules that we have in place to deal with sensitive fuel cycle activities like enrichment or reprocessing. And I happen to be of the mind that going forward, we are going to have to consider a world in which we have some kind of restriction on reprocessing, enrichment. Well, both. And I tend to be skeptical of a kind of situation in which you create haves and have-nots. It seems to me that almost always lacks legitimacy, and in the world we live in, our export controls and our intelligence capabilities may, over the long run, not be able to catch a determined cheater in time and put us in a position to do something about it. And so, although it's hard to imagine, I would suggest a non-discriminatory rule that we may end up having to confront is not permitting sensitive fuel cycle technologies on a national basis, but rather insist that they always be conducted on a multinational basis, and ideally in an environment where they are governed by a corporate board, which is responsible to shareholders and governments, rather than a sort of single national program. And I know that's hard to imagine. I think probably only Jeff Forden sitting here can dream of such a world. But I would submit that basically the entirety of Western civilization has been trying to find a way to adapt very temporary and fallible human institutions to rapid technological change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Three very rich presentations. Before I'd like to open the floor for your questions and comments, we should have about 25 minutes or so. Let me just use the occasion at the moment to thank a couple of people. Our public policy scholar here, Avner Cohen, who was instrumental in helping to bring this event about, and also my assistant, Timothy MacDonald, in the back, who has helped organize this event. Let me also thank our internal co-sponsors, the International Security Studies Division, headed by Rob Litwak, and our Middle East program, headed by Hale Esfandiari. And let me remind you again that this event is being live webcast, and so please wait for the microphone, and in Wilson Center tradition, please state your name and, if you like, your affiliation as you comment or question. So, Avner. Hold on, microphone.
Well, I'm ready to share with you, with Houston, with David, with Jeffrey, two historical anecdotes which I think are interesting, that I was aware when I did my Israel and the Bomb 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, and at the time I decided to hardly to elaborate on them, and I'm ready to say a little bit more about them than I said then, which I think is interesting, and I would be curious about what the panel's members can say about them. The first one is that it's unknown, but when Israel made its own big deliberations on the nuclear issue between 55 and 57, what route to take, one prominent member of the scientific Israeli small team that was involved in that deliberation, I'm not going to mention his name, the name is well known and he's still alive, he's very old, was pushing very hard to go to centrifuge. His argument was just what Jeffrey said. His argument was it would allow us to be almost with no signature. The idea was that Israel would be able to extract its natural uranium from its phosphates in the Negev, and we will have to depend very little on suppliers. The minus, of course, we're talking about 55, 56, 57. The man was a great expert in isotopes, and he had a small team around him who was helping him. It was unclear for how long this R&D project could go. It was intrinsic R&D project that run by the country itself with very little assistance from abroad. And there was many, many uncertainties. When Shimon Peres was able to get a deal with France, as he used the phrase, we're not going to invent the wheel, he was using those things in order to get the reactor from France, the whole thing went into that area. But it was, and that man still thought that perhaps it would be the best in terms of cost, in terms of strategy, in terms of time to go into the centrifuge. I'm not saying that Israel completely abandoned that. Actually, Israel did not. But the main approach was via plutonium, not via centrifuge. But one can wonder what kind of counterfactual history we would have had Israel chosen that kind of path. That's one comment, historical footnote. The other one is about Zippo.
Briefly, right?
Well, it's a scoop what I'm going to say, so I'll try to be brief because I cannot tell anyway the whole story. David gave Zippo very nice credentials after he left the United States. Well, the story, when I researched, was a little different. The Israelis believed in the early 60s that Zippo and others in Germany were approached by NASA scientists to help them to build a centrifuge nuclear program in Egypt. And Zippo was very much followed and monitored by the Israelis. At one point, he was, I think under some kind of trick, he was summoned into some hotel in Europe, I believe in Germany, and he was essentially questioned for a long time, for 2 or 3 days, by a long Israeli delegation. They were undercover as if they are from another NATO country. And he was quite shaken by that, and they got enormous amount of information. And they felt that he realized that they're asking more than just about Egypt, and I think that he realized himself that they're asking more than just Egypt. I heard a story from the guy who is no longer with us. He died 2 or 3 years ago, so I mentioned to say it in a very broad sense. But in the 60s, Zippo was monitored, and the Israelis believed that he was scared to death in that episode, and this was one reason why he decided not to continue to work for the Egyptians. Again, this is one source, one side, and I know that the story from Zippo is a little different, but that's the 2 historical footnotes I just wanted to share.
Thank you, Avner. Houston or David, would you like to react?
Yeah, Zippo does tell a different story. There's the intersection, and Avner and I have actually worked on this together. What Zippo told me, this is back in the mid-'90s, I mean, he didn't want me to share until after he had died, and then probably not even then. And I suffer from a bad memory. I have extensive notes, but and I didn't expect Avner's comment. But Zippo felt, and he said it very strongly, that he didn't want to have anything to do with nuclear weapons in Egypt or anywhere else. His colleagues did approach him, but he was never going to help them and thought they were crazy to think that they would get his help. But at the same time, he was meeting with some of them. And it does raise the question could he have, in some sense, been manipulated by the Egyptians or not. But I think that the answer that I felt satisfied with was it wasn't going to happen. One is he was well aware the Israelis were sending letter bombs into, I forget the Egyptian or the German scientists or engineers who was in Egypt helping build rocket motors or jet engines. And so he was well aware of sort of the heavy hand, and I don't think he would have done anything. The question Avner's raising, though, is did Zippo indirectly help Israel build a gas centrifuge program? And that's the big question. And I hope actually Avner and I could work on this together to try to flesh this out a bit. And now that, and unfortunately, Zippo has passed away, but certainly the restrictions are lifted on the story. And then the Israeli side, it sounds like some of the restrictions have been lifted.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Yes, gentlemen.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I think it's easy, this is a response to Jeffrey's, one of his last points, I think it's easy now to wish for a different contract during the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty concerning the full nuclear fuel cycle, that was a big mistake. I guess my historical question is, would it have been an option, with the knowledge we have now, would we have gotten an NPT if we would have said that you do not have the option to unilaterally develop a fuel cycle?
No, I don't mean to suggest that at the moment the rules were created that there was some incompetence. I think we probably got the best bargain we could as an international community, and it's funny that the Iranians are the people now who are so strong on Article 4, because it was like the Germans and the Japanese who pressed on that for those rights. So I don't think you could have done that. My only point is that I think we were slow to recognize the pace of technological change, and like so many things, when you fall behind and you suddenly realize the magnitude, that then we panicked and overreacted, and that the degree to which people seem to be throwing up their hands about our ability to deal with non-proliferation cases seems to me to be panic, and that there is stuff we can do, and that the record isn't quite as bad as it is. So I don't think we could have gotten a better NPT deal, but going forward, we have to start thinking about what kind of arrangements we want.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Alan Crass. I would just like to drop the other shoe on this discussion about Israel, because it's something I've wondered about for many, many years. Is the conclusion that Israel, irrespective of how they may have acquired it, does Israel have a gas centrifuge capability?
I believe so.
Thank you.
Yeah,
the other...
Yeah, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
What Zippo ended up thinking was that the Israelis were asking him, what companies do we watch to see if Egyptians show up? He started to believe that they were asking so they could go there too. Yeah.
Okay. I have one other quick comment to make, and that is about Jeffrey's comments about the people not being alert to the dangers of the technology.
You are quite an exception to that.
And I worked on this problem extensively back in 1980, and the major conclusion of our book was that the centrifuge is by far the most attractive technology from the standpoint of proliferation, and that the risks of centrifuges were greater than any of the other ways in which people enriched uranium. So there were some people who saw that coming.
Let me put in a plug. It's back in print now, right? I think it is.
It's on the CIPRI website.
Right. Oh, right. You can. Yes. So it's 1983, and it's called Uranium Enrichment.
81. Right? It's called 81. Uranium Enrichment and Nuclear Weapons Proliferation.
It's fantastic, and I actually just sent the entire thing to a research assistant today. Yes, you are one of the rare exceptions, and it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Pete, right there, and then we'll go to the gentleman to the left.
Najm Meshkati, University of Southern California. I have a question for Professor Wood.
Please speak up.
I have a question for Professor Wood. Is laser enrichment disruptive technology? Is it the next wave for enrichment technology after centrifuge? And if so, what are the potential for that?
Well, that's a question that we pursued laser technology for several decades around the world, and no one was able to make it commercially viable. So the question is whether it could be done on a clandestine manner to make a few nuclear weapons. But I think it's not been proven for a large-scale uranium enrichment, unless something comes along in the near future. Of course, there is a process that is laser-based that is now, it's called the Silex process, that came out of Australia and is now owned by General Electric. And General Electric is building a pilot plant in, down near Wilmington, North Carolina, that area. And that General Electric is saying that they're doing this for commercial purposes to make enriched uranium for nuclear power reactors. And that is laser-based. And they're very, very closed about their process, and but they're putting a lot of money into it. So they must think that it has a way to go. Now, the question is, as long as only General Electric has it, it's okay, at least for now, you know. But what about the proliferation of that? And I think there's some issues that I would like to see addressed by the international community on making all uranium enrichment facilities subject to safeguards and inspections. And so far, the ones that the plants being built in the United States are not falling into that category. So, and General Electric, you know, has not yet agreed to have any kind of international inspections there.
Can I add one thing? Yeah, one of the lessons of all these cases is you should build high walls around the sensitive information. I mean, we're not talking about leakage from the U.S. Gas Centrifuge program, for example. Probably most people have no idea what that centrifuge really uses to work. And there's a reason for that. And your Renko security was extremely lax. And so the lesson would be that if they're going to develop laser isotope separation anywhere, that the walls around that information have got to be high, and it has to be maintained indefinitely. Because if that technology does develop and mature, 15, 20, 30 years from now, it'll probably be easier to replicate. And so you have to keep the classified information out of the hands of the proliferators.
Yeah, I'll put in a plug for the U.S. government. In the late 1970s, if you recall, the Swedes had investigated having nuclear power reactors, nuclear energy, and they looked at gas centrifuges. And they wrote, when they got out of the business, they wrote a report. And I received a copy of the report from the person in Sweden who had put this together, and they had several pages on every country in the world. Italy had tried gas centrifuges, Japan, France, all the countries that had done gas centrifuge work. There was several pages and maybe some pictures and so forth. And there was one paragraph that said, "We have no idea what they're doing in the United States." So I took that to my security officer, classification officer, when I was working in Oak Ridge. That made his day, you know. But I think, but I will give, in Europe now with Euratom, they have very high level of security, and they're inspecting the plants there. So they have sort of a multinational regional security in addition to the International Atomic Energy Agency.
All right. The gentleman up here.
What was the nature specifically of the technical breakthrough that allowed the Germans and the Russians and the Dutch to prove that the centrifuges worked, whereas the U.S. was basically dumping on it, felt that it didn't work?
Could you state your name, please?
Oh, Ed Miller.
You mean back in the early days? I think the major problems were mechanical problems in getting the rotor to spin very rapidly and how the rotor was supported. And Zippo came up with an innovative way for supporting the rotor, the bearing system on the bottom of the centrifuge, and that had not been discovered in the United States. And so that was a key feature that he brought.
Thank you.
or others too.
Yes.
Yeah, there are some other things, but that was one of the key things, getting the rotors up to high speeds. There are things called scoops that they came up with, but there were several areas of technology that they innovated.
My name is David Dixon. I would like to talk about sort of how this thing goes forward in the future, and really the issues of sort of the politics of making decisions in the international community. Certainly President Putin has proposed something very similar to what Jeffrey proposed, that there would be specific centers where this work is done, and that would be the only place in the world. And there's been a little bit of warming up to that notion, but it hasn't really taken off. So again, I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on the politics of the decision-making process along those lines.
I'm not sure who wants to try to answer this one.
I mean, I guess that's me. I guess the first thing I would say is I don't think this is going to be easy. And I suspect that there are a lot of countries that talk about having enrichment programs for the same reason that countries talk about having national airlines. Right? They don't make any sense whatsoever, but that they're on economic grounds, but there's a certain amount of national pride involved and a certain degree of wanting to make your own fuel, so you're not subject to the whims of the colonialist powers or whatever your particular flavor of geopolitical critique is. And so, when I think about how to do this going forward, I think it's got to be a combination of, on the one hand, a general principle that countries not do things on a national basis, and a focus on making sure that we have access not just to facilities but to people, so we can really get inside the programs. But as for the specific arrangements, I mean, my advice would be to be much more flexible and ad hoc. If some countries want to do enrichment through a center at like Angarsk, that's great. But if they want to set up their own consortia, then we should allow sort of multiple ad hoc arrangements that range from just investing money to actual sort of Urenco-like programs. And it's not catchy. There's no kind of big bang there. So there's sort of no killer idea. But it seems to me that, an ad hoc approach like that, even if it is not conceptually satisfying, is probably more likely to succeed than some of the approaches we've seen in the past where you try to divide the world up into haves and have-nots. Because I think as soon as you start saying that you're going to draw this line, you start to see the South Africans kind of like edging back into the business because they don't want to be on the wrong side of it.
Just one comment I'd make on that. David was talking about putting up high walls around the technology and so forth and protecting that. And really, the real failure that we've had in the past has been in a multinational organization. So, so just saying multinational, it's got to be more than that. And so you have to come up with a way. And then if you're going to do this in one country, in the United States, for example, Urenco is building a plant in New Mexico. So how do we protect, it starts getting kind of cloudy when you move one country's technology into another country, and you can think of all kind of scenarios of certain countries you put it in and you would not want to take it there. So anyway, it's not a simple answer, but it's something that needs to be investigated.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I mean, there are two senses of multinational there. I mean, having a multinational facility might build confidence among the parties that no individual is cheating, but it doesn't relieve you of your responsibilities not to make sure that your scientists don't walk off and do stuff. But that's a problem for a national program, and that's certainly what the Pakistanis then subsequently claimed Khan did.
Yeah, and let me add, Urenco cleaned up its act dramatically, particularly the revelations in 95, 96 in Iraq led to major restructuring of parts of Urenco. So the Khan episode didn't, but the German centrifuge leakage actually led to very dramatic changes, and their security is much tighter now. I won't guarantee it, but
Urenco is broken into two companies now, so that one company does the marketing and sales, and another company does the technology, and the marketing and sales and the operation of the plants. And so the people operating the plants don't get the technology anymore. So they've made their own division internally, and I think that's making them a much stronger company.
We're just about out of time. Any final questions? And we'll go there. One final comment. Okay.
About the Silex process, and it's relevant to this discussion of classification. As I think Dr. Wood said, that came out of Australia, that process. And I was working in the State Department at that time, and I was part of the team that helped to negotiate an agreement between the United States government and the Australian government about how this sharing of information between Australia and between the Silex Corporation and General Electric, and actually at that time it wasn't General Electric, it was another company. But anyway, those walls were erected through a very, very complex process of negotiation between Australia and the United States before either side would allow any sharing of information in either direction. And that process is finished, and those barriers are in place. And as David says, we hope they'll stay where they are for a long time.
Great. Well, let me, with thanks to our three panelists for three terrific presentations. Thank you also for your comments and questions. Thank you. We're adjourned.